So it's great to be here. My name is Kathleen Robinette. I'm the president of e.Republic. And we do a few things in the government space. We publish Governing Magazine, which is a public policy magazine for governors, mayors, legislators, etc. Government Technology, Technology Magazine, Public CIO, which is federal, state, and local C-suite folks. Emergency Management. And we have 3 research institutes, the Governing Institute, the Center for Digital Government, and the Center for Digital Education. So I spend my life 24/7 doing state and local and education and federal as it relates to the rest of the world that we live in. So this morning I want to give a few remarks before I bring up a very distinguished panel that I'm excited about. But first, let's just start here. How many of you were at the keynote yesterday? Was everyone at the keynote yesterday? I really thought it was spectacular. And if you look here at this dome, the center of government used to be, obviously, these capitals, these buildings. So it really represents an older time in government and technology. And now we're really moving to the edges. And I'm very excited about that. A few things that are happening today that I think are very interesting, and maybe they're happening in your jurisdictions. There are some new titles popping up. About 5 years ago, the Center for Digital Government did a keynote talking to chief information officers that these new titles were emerging. So if you look at chief innovation officers, in fact, the first one was in Maryland many years ago. He came from the city, he came from actually Washington, D.C., and later went to the federal government from that position. But now we have chief innovation officers. We actually have a conference that we do with the city of Louisville that's coming up in June that's for innovation officers, performance officers, data officers. You can see digital officers. I like the bicycle officer, chief bicycle officer. I want that job, actually. Privacy connection officers, really interesting times. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I think today I'm more excited than ever because I think there's finally a wave of change happening in the state and local level. So overall, IT spending in cities, counties, and states is $96 billion. That is actually up 2.5% from the previous year. And as our budgets continue to do okay, except it was interesting that we had the oil-producing states were doing really well, and now they're not doing so well. But there is so much pent-up demand in cities, counties, and states for old legacy systems. Any of you have issues with old legacy systems? So a lot of pent-up demand there. And what's interesting today is that the federal government has an active presence. I really applaud our president for all the things that he has done to drive technology in this nation. I'm very excited because we have 2 speakers who can comment on that more this morning. But he was the first one to appoint a chief information officer, a chief technology officer, data officer. And it was very interesting because those first 2 guys I knew, so Vivek Kundra and Anish Chopra, both were from the state and local world. And in fact, they were with us at a leadership retreat. Is Stuart here? Stuart with Microsoft? So Stuart was with us. And these 2 guys were with us at a leadership retreat in Arizona when they both got the call from the White House. So it was a very exciting time. And for us to really look at federal and actually think federal was behind state and local to see some of the changes that have really happened at the federal level is very exciting. Now, I'm going to ask one of my panelists about healthcare.gov, and he can tell kind of the story of what happened with that and because of that. But I really think the president here has a legacy And
part of my job is to try to institutionalize that over the next several years. And I want to make sure that the next president and the federal government from here on out is in constant improvement mode, and we're constantly bringing in new talent and new ideas to solve some of these big problems. It can be done. It requires some effort,
right?
But everything requires some effort.
Isn't that the truth? So Dan is actually going to talk about that today. But this concept of building digital services, looking at innovation, and how do you institutionalize innovation in your organizations? I think that's a really important point as we move forward. Now, some of the themes of this conference and some of the things that we're seeing across the nation, if you look at cloud. You know, 5 years ago, there was a lot of hype on cloud. People were talking about cloud, but we really didn't see a lot of adoption. This is a recent study here that we just finished. So if you look at here, public cloud, who's implemented at an enterprise level, you can see those states. You can see some in the blue who've done something at an agency level, maybe not enterprise. And then you can see those yellow states that not currently in place, and actually the 2 gray states did not respond. We couldn't find any information. But if you look at this, there's the low-hanging fruit that's going on with cloud today. It started with storage, GIS, some of those services that you could do. And as you all know, it will continue to be more and more availability in cloud. It's definitely a strategy for cities, counties, states, and the federal government, which has made it a priority as well. Now let's talk a little bit about data. Open data, big data, analytics. A lot of talk here as well. In fact, on the panel today, we have one of the foremost experts on open data in the country, probably the world. A lot of this was driven from the federal government, and now in local government is where we see the most of it. And I'm really anxious to see the promise of all of that. Here is a scorecard that was developed, so you can see some of the things that have been adopted. All that red, those are our big fat Fs. So we hope to see over time that this graphic actually changes and that you'll see the different grading systems and much more adoption of this, as well as being transparent. Not only what the administration was pushing transparency, but state and local government was also pushing transparency, and we'll continue to do that as a theme. Now, when it comes to analytics, we are starting to see some interesting things happen, particularly in the finance area. So from tax collection, tax fraud, revenues being boosted, property taxes, you'll see I have an example from Georgia, Florida, Miami-Dade. So this is being embraced particularly here. Next, I think we're going to see this in the health and human services arena. It's a tough play for some folks, though, to admit how much abuse, fraud, waste maybe has happened. So it's really hard to have those conversations. In fact, sometimes it's really hard to get information regarding that. But we really think there is a fair amount of activity here, kind of a lot of hype about data, but this will be, in a few years, where cloud was before. Now, part of the problem in government is the data itself. So we actually ran this cover story on governing that was called Bad Data. And what we found is, unfortunately, a lot of the information is not maybe as valuable or accurate as possible. You can see this statistic here, right, that 54% said that they've encountered data quality issues frequently. So I think for all of us, whether it's public sector or private sector, helping the public sector, we really have to look at this concept of the data being accurate. So until that happens, we really can't have the promise of big data and the promise of analytics. Another huge theme, federal, state, and local, is cyber, as it is everywhere. I really think, though, this is a #1 issue and something that we all have to take with much responsibility and, I think, passion to push this through. A few things that we've done is we actually came out with a guide for elected officials on cybersecurity. Because when you talk to technology professionals, they understand, but that's like preaching to the choir. So what we've tried to do is appeal to those folks who are funding this and making it a priority. Because what we're seeing in places where it is a priority, for example, Governor McAuliffe in Virginia, very much a technology governor, really understands this. Cyber is his #1 concern. So I think when you have that leadership, it's very, very important. And if you look at what's happened today, if you look at, let's say, Ferguson, because of Ferguson and hacktivists, Missouri really was in trouble in this area. So it's not just major metropolitan areas, it's not key target states. And obviously, our federal government is focusing on this 24/7. But this today really is a big priority for all of us. And the public and private have to work together here. Citizen engagement, another thing we're going to talk about in the panel following. I love this quote. So Eric Gordon, he runs the Engagement Lab. And he kind of calls social media, if you just have a little bit of social media engagement, he calls that citizen engagement light. Because the more citizen engagement that you really get involved with and embrace, the least efficient it is. And he's a big proponent of citizen engagement. And I think if you look at the potential of government in the citizen engagement arena, it's very exciting. In fact, there are students that just won a program that we do with the Fels Institute called the Government Challenge. And they developed an elections app for millennials that's really exciting. And you look at some of the things that are going on in this area, it's really the most exciting stuff I think that's happening today. Because if you look here, smartphones, really, and you look at the keynote yesterday, what was talked about, and the demonstration that we saw with Skype and Cortana, this really is the only government that she knows. Now, I have a few stats up here. You can see the Apple privacy security question here. What we thought was interesting about this is that citizens are really split here between privacy and security. And then if you look at the world of all of us and the apps that are on our phone, and really government needs to transition to this world. Part of our problem is this concept of procurement. Have any of you ever encountered procurement getting in the way of innovation? So another thing that we've done is we've really tried to challenge this. As we do the digital state survey, we actually rank every state in the nation on their use of technology, every county, every city, every school district, every community college. Here what we try to do is tackle procurement, because what happens even at the federal level, at the state level, at a local level, systems were put in place that are really antiquated. So what we wanted to do with this purchase power article here was to look at states and actually give them a ranking on how it was to do business with them. Because I think what happens is the governor gets elected, appoint a secretary of administration or someone like that. Same thing happens in cities, and they don't pay any attention to it. It's not sexy, it's not exciting, but it's definitely hindering our way that we procure technology. So a few things that we've done, we've got the 21 steps to the cloud. This was a public-private partnership that we did to come together with recommendations that so many different jurisdictions have adopted. And then we really came out with this ranking. I highly recommend you read this. So there are some states that have done well. So Utah, Virginia, Minnesota, Ohio, Georgia, Massachusetts, those are all in the top 5. And you can see why. But a lot of that actually had to do with how they automated technology in the first place, how innovative they were trying to be from that, and it also goes back to leadership. One other thing I just want to point out, you should check out the Gov Tech 100 is a list that we just came out with. These are 100 companies dealing just with public sector, and the apps and some of the things that we're doing, it's just amazing. I love this list, and I'm excited about this list because there are new companies that are coming in that have great ideas that are very, very different, kind of new, fresh, and happening. So check out that list. I think that's very exciting. Because unfortunately, this is not a very good slide, particularly after the keynote yesterday. Actually, I watched that keynote and I went, oh my goodness, wow, this is such a possibility, and you see where government is today. Maybe not your government if you're really happening, but for the majority, government's right there. And I think it's important to look at where we're going. So if you look at Gov as an API, you look at this concept of engagement, you look at your engagement strategy, you really have the policies and practices in place, you're looking at business intelligence, you're looking at your business process, which is really hard to do. You're having great data, you're using it for analytics, and you're really focusing on cloud services, which is really the future. This vision, I think, that was presented yesterday becomes possible for government. And if you look at Cortana here, we will be able to, from machine to machine, pay our utility bill or fill out forms or some of the promise of that low-hanging fruit. So check out government as an API. That's also available on government technology. And with that, we can make these slides available. But I want to bring up my panelists because I'm very excited to have them here with us. So Dan Pfeiffer, the Vice President of Communications and Policy, GoFundMe. Dan, come on up. That's right, give him a big hand. Former White House official. And our next speaker, I'm supposed to say her son, her 6-year-old son, told me how to introduce her. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Beth Simone Novak.
My son and my agent.
That's right, he's your agent. And also Jesse Bruce, the chairman of the Smart Cities Council. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you.
All right. So, what I want the three of you to do first is just give a little update on what you're currently working on. All of you have amazing backgrounds. Dan, let's start with you and just tell them you went from the White House to GoFundMe.
I did. So I left the White House after 8 years working for President Obama, 2 years on the first campaign, 6 years in the White House. Took a long time off, and about 4 months ago, I joined GoFundMe as the Vice President of Policy and Communications and Policy. GoFundMe is world's largest online fundraising company, and it's been obviously very different than the White House, but not terribly dissimilar from my experience on the Obama campaign in the sense that it really is about democratizing and pushing power down to people to be able to do things in their own community, some of the bottom-up organizing that was at the core of the Obama campaigns.
Okay, great. So Beth, you are the founder of Govlab. So tell us a little bit about that. Also, the first Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. So
That's right. When Vivek and Anish got that call when they were in Arizona, I was the person on the other end. Since I was there first, having worked also on the campaign and then in the transition team, focused again on setting up at that point what was the first effort in a presidential transition to focus on technology and innovation, what we call the Technology Innovation government reform team, and then I went on to become deputy CTO and focus on open government for the first 2 years of the administration. And then after not long enough off, I admit in between, went back to the university where I was coming from to set up a group called the Governance Lab, where we work with governments. We're focused on what happens the day after the election rather than the day before. We work with governments at the federal, state, and local level, national and international, so a range of institutions and public institutions, really looking at how they solve problems using technology. And that's as much about the kinds of tech and innovation that you talked about, but probably even more so about addressing what the core problems are at the root and how we can use innovative strategies. Those might mean technologies of data. They might mean technologies relating to communications, collective intelligence, and collaboration, those kinds of engagement tools, or new insights from the social sciences, really whatever new techniques we can apply to help us solve problems that improve people's lives.
That's great. Jesse, tell us a little bit about the Smart Cities Council.
Smart Cities Council is a coalition of smart city practitioners and vendors together with an advisory group of universities, national laboratories, development banks, standards groups. And our job is to support and educate cities and help them get ready for this amazing transformation that's now upon us. So we have a whole readiness program, Smart Cities Readiness Guide, Smart Cities Financing Guide, readiness workshops, readiness assessments, readiness plans, whatever it takes to help a city get ready and take advantage of this opportunity.
Okay, great. How many of you are here from government? And how many are state? We have state or federal? And local? All right. And then we have industry, kind of servicing the industry folks, taking good care of government. Good. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Actually, Dan, I want to start with you. All eyes are on the crazy election that's going on, I think, or at least some eyes. So how has the internet changed the whole presidential election process? I know you've been part of that. Can you shed some history maybe on that and also talk about what's happening today?
Sure. The first Obama 2008 campaign was described by a lot of people as the first candidate to really use the internet to get elected. And there was truth to that in the sense that in order for Barack Obama to win the Democratic nomination, he had to expand the pool of voters beyond the people who traditionally vote in Democratic primaries. It's just the same group of people who had voted in the 2004 election had voted in 2008. Hillary Clinton would have beat Barack Obama by a decent amount. And the key set of people that we needed to bring in the process were young people. Now the challenge was younger potential voters are people who are less likely to consume information in all the ways in which traditional political campaigns would do it, whether through the local news, through newspapers, television commercials, and so we had to find new ways to do that, and that the internet was the way to do that. Now, for as revolutionary as that seemed at the time, that really, even though it's been 8 years in real years, it's been like 50 years in technology years. If you think about the moment when the president started running for office, Facebook was only available to college students, really only used by college students. Twitter was something only used in Silicon Valley. The iPhone had not been invented. Netflix was a DVD mailing service. And so we've come a very, very long way in these 8 years. And I always describe this period of time in which the president has been in office as the 8 years of greatest transformation in how people consume and distribute information since either the invention of the printing press. Sometimes I say that, and then people come back and say the telegraph. But either one, it's been a long time. And in this election, I think we're finally seeing, in 2008, the internet and sort of digital organizing and communication was an add-on to traditional communication. In 2012, it got a little more closer to parity because Facebook became much more prominent. Twitter became a very important political communication tool. But still, the traditional things of political commercials, being on Meet the Press in 60 Minutes or CNN were still a big piece of it. In 2016, the prominence of social media as a way in which a huge percentage of Americans consume their news has altered a lot of the original equation. And Donald Trump is a unique figure in a lot of ways, but certainly in politics because of his celebrity. But what he has been able to do using social media as a main outlet to communicate his information has been incredibly powerful and unprecedented. And just to think about how it used to be pretty close to, not guaranteed, but if you had the most money to run the most TV ads, you're going to do very well. Donald Trump got outspent in the Florida primary almost 20-1 and still won by double digits. And what it is doing is a lot of the fundamental assumptions that political professionals have made about how you win and run campaigns are being questioned now in really fundamental ways. And I think what you're seeing, what it has done is, in some ways, for good or for ill, it has democratized political power in some ways, where you see it on the Republican side with Donald Trump, who has at the outset, no endorsements of powerful people, raised almost no money. He had some of his own money to spend, but it was a fraction of what Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz spent. On the Democratic side, you have Bernie Sanders, who no political endorsements, no establishment support, no big, bundlers and fundraisers, but has been able to raise. He, in the last month, outraised Hillary Clinton, huge front runner, sort of on a path to be the nomination, by $12 million, and did it all through the internet. That's a few years ago, that would have been impossible, and it has created an environment where these anti-establishment outsider candidates can reach prominence and have real campaigns in ways they would not just a few years ago.
Right. Now, Beth, you and I had talked yesterday a little bit about the people aspect of this. I think it's really important when I'm talking to government folks around the country, we're really having a bit of a crisis from a technology standpoint, and I think you have some really interesting points to make on people and finding people and maybe even seeing the people that you have differently.
Well, I think just to pick up on Dan's point, if you look at also what's been unprecedented, you mentioned this in your introduction, what happens the day after the election is, of course, the creation of these new roles: chief technology officer, a chief information officer, the reinvention of that role, now a chief data scientist, the kind of replication of those roles across government. This week I spoke to the UK's new chief people officer. That's not on your list, although I still think chief bicycle officer is better. And importantly also the efforts to institutionalize tech and innovation, to recognize we have to bring these same kinds of trends into how we govern. We're going to do that in part by creating some of these new roles from the top down, to create leadership, to create vision, to focus people on thinking about tech and innovation. We have to do more than have a few people, though, sitting in a White House office, right? So then we try to get a bit more agile about how we bring talent in, and we create something like the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, a way of kind of initially parachuting in smart people from Silicon Valley and elsewhere who know about tech. Starts out mildly effective, but gets much better because why? They begin to tether the Presidential Innovation Fellows to civil servants who have actual projects and problems to work on, so that they become very outcome-driven. And then the creation of new offices like an 18F, a government digital service, again, the institutionalization, so we can grow that talent pool and continue that work over the long term. So it's not just a 6-month project working on, for example, giving veterans more portability for their healthcare records, but it's the ability then to create a whole institute, a group that can help many people learn about human-centered design, to learn about the practice of agile development, to take projects that can take more than 6 months, frankly, and try to drive them home. But what's really exciting, and I think coming next, as we look ahead to a next administration, is both the deepening and broadening of these new kinds of roles, but the effort to bring out more of the talent that's already there from the bottom up. It's hiding in plain sight in many cases. You have people, there's a 4 million strong federal service and plenty of people at the state and local level who have tech skills, who have data analytics skills. What we have now is trouble finding them. So what's exciting are the efforts to use tech, particularly data-driven tech, to allow us to match the problems and challenges that we have to the talent wherever it sits. So I'll give you just 2 quick examples. The Environmental Protection Agency in the last year has just stood up a project called the One EPA Skills Marketplace. It's essentially a want-ad site where you say, I have a project, and I need people with the following kinds of skills to work on it, wherever they may sit, in whichever silo they sit in the bureaucracy. And people, sort of like a Google 20% time, can say, oh, I want to work on that project from wherever they sit, no matter which office they're in or where in the country they're located, and be part of a team, so new agile ways of creating teams. So that's the people finding the project. And then there are other projects like Health and Human Services that are standing up a program called HHS Profiles, which is using expert networking technology to essentially catalog what the skills are across 110,000 people in the department so that you can reach out and find the people, put together teams in new ways. So I think it's these kinds of what some people in industry call people analytics. They're going to help us to reorganize how we work, create more agile teams, pull from people, and they're not going to necessarily sit in the same office, and they're not even necessarily going to sit in the same jurisdiction of government. We may be talking about pulling people from state, local, federal, across public and private to form teams in new ways to work on hard problems.
So Jesse, hold on for a second. I actually want to do a follow-up question. So I think this is a good time to talk about healthcare.gov. Let's talk about that.
It's actually never a good time to talk about
Well,
healthcare.
that is true. However, there were some lessons learned from that and some outcomes that I think are very positive.
So I think it's important to first understand how far behind, which is I think a topic is how far behind government is in technology, right? When we got to the White House, after being on the campaign with all these Google engineers who were volunteering on the campaign, and Eric Schmidt would come help us out, and we had 100 people working in our digital office. You get to the White House, and there was a digital staff of, one person. Yeah, exactly. There was, laptops were something you could check out only if you had family, so you could work from home.
Oh.
Yeah, it wasn't particularly progressive policy either. The computers were old, all GChat, Facebook, Gmail, all blocked in your computers. You were like in a social media black hole. And it took us years to just get up to what would be barely acceptable in the private sector in terms of the sort of IT available to the White House. They have made leaps and bounds in the last couple of years here. Like the White House staffers now have iPhones instead of BlackBerries, which we had the whole time I was there, which everyone always laughs about. And so one of the things, so the healthcare.gov was the most complicated IT project probably certainly in the history of government in terms of building this very complex website that would do a lot in terms of verifying people's income via the IRS, obviously a huge data security question, but it was built through the traditional way of doing IT in the government. You had a lot of different contractors working together, and it didn't work. It didn't work doesn't mean had glitches. Fundamentally broken, and which the president would say was his greatest domestic policy failure, right? And there is nothing that focuses the mind like the president's top domestic policy accomplishment being in grave danger. Right. And so it became pretty clear that we did not have, there were a handful of very smart people within the government with very solid tech backgrounds like Todd Park, who is a CTO in the White House, but not enough people to solve this problem. And so a lot of people in the White House went out to Silicon Valley and asked people to come help us because we were desperate. We could not fix it with the current situation, and brought in all these very smart people. Some of them were the Presidential Innovation Fellows. And we learned a lot from that. One, we were even further behind on the tech IT world than we thought. Two, if you ask really smart, public service-oriented people from Silicon Valley to come to the White House and help, or come to the government and help, they will do it. They felt that. And Mikey Dickerson, who basically helped save healthcare.gov and then came to the White House to help run the US Digital Service, would say when he talks to people about why he did it is he'd been at Google for a very long time, one of the most well thought of people in Silicon Valley, and he said, I could spend the next few years of my life improving Google search, or I could come give healthcare to people. Man, he had spent a lot of time doing Google search, but giving healthcare to people was something, he had a unique skill that very people could do, and he could do that. And because of Mikey and people like him, that millions of people now have healthcare, because had that not happened, the system would not have worked, the law would have collapsed, and we would have set the cause of health reform back. But what has come from that, and you heard the president briefly in that interview clip from his trip to South by Southwest, which also shows how far we've come in terms of focusing on tech. But he was there I mean, in part because Austin's cool, and because South by Southwest is a cool event, but mainly to recruit more people from the tech world to come into government. And he fundamentally believes that it's his penance for healthcare.gov breaking is to to do everything he can to set up the next president, be it Republican or Democrat, with a better situation than he had in terms of improving tech in government, improving the user experience for how people interface with government, improving the basic IT infrastructure in the system. And I do believe that over the course of time, it probably won't be his sexiest accomplishment, but the U.S. Digital Service and the things that have happened in the last 3 to 4 years here to improve that will be one of the most long-lasting and impactful things the president does.
Yeah, I agree. So Jesse, if you look at cities, I think cities are actually doing some of the best work. I love working with cities personally. So you said every year you have some words, and this year it's connected, climate, and compassion.
That's right.
So those are 3 important concepts for a smart city. Can you talk about that?
Well, first let me say I had the same experience when I moved to cities. I was a little, let's say, pessimistic about the federal government and its ability to get things done. And then you meet these mayors, and they're so impassioned, and they have such a sense of urgency, and they're going to get something done, and it's very hopeful. So every year we try to highlight 3 words that we think spotlight certain issues that are being overlooked. And so the first one this year is connectivity, especially in this country. And I travel around the world visiting smart cities. So many cities don't yet have that fundamental connectivity. You have to be a gigabit city. And that's just the table stakes. That just lets you compete with all the other cities around the world who are after your jobs and your talent, right? So that's the first thing. Second, climate. We all want to hit these climate goals, but some cities still don't realize that you have to use smart technology. It's not the only thing, but it has to be in your toolbox, right? So conservation won't get us there alone. Energy efficiency won't get us there alone. Bike lanes won't get us there alone. We've got to embrace these smart technologies. And then third, compassion. These same technologies that are revolutionizing government are also our greatest tools ever to narrow the digital divide, to reach out to those less fortunate. But to do that, you have to be explicit about it. You can't be sitting back thinking, yeah, of course we're going to help, people who are not as well off. You've got to say it out loud, and then you've got to ask the right questions. Well, how might that work for the homeless? Well, what if you're unbanked? Well, what if you don't have a broadband connection? What about those neighborhoods? What about the handicapped, et cetera? And if you will do that, if you'll be explicit up front and ask those questions, then quite often there are great answers. You just have to look for them.
True. Now, how do you think, if you look at the Internet of Things, I think there are so many aspects of that for everyone. But with cities, talk about that a little bit. What is that going to do, and what is that going to do for some of our public policies today? Because I don't really know if people quite get the impact of the Internet of Things.
Well, smart cities is going to be, by most measures, it's the single biggest vertical within the larger Internet of Things because it embraces so many things. I think the thing I notice about cities is they are failing to put these fundamental policies in place. And I would, the Smart Cities Readiness Guide is 27 foundational principles for a smart city. And one of them is a citywide data privacy policy. A second one is a citywide cybersecurity policy. And yet, when 2 years ago we surveyed city leaders around North America, almost a third of them had no cybersecurity or data privacy policy. Another third had it only by department basis. So you're hoping that every department figures cybersecurity out and every department figures out data privacy and gets it right, and that's crazy. So those are a couple of Internet of Things issues that I think cities need to grapple with. And the good news is you don't have to make it up. There's wonderful templates. First of all, if you're working with a good cloud provider, you're getting great cybersecurity and a framework to start with. Secondly, if you're doing something like data privacy, you can go look at Seattle's policy they just published, or the one they did in Ontario, and you can mix and match and get the right data privacy policy for your city.
Great segue to one of the biggest issues of our time. Beth, do you want to comment on cyber? I think it's a really important part of this whole discussion because it's really kind of the foundation and bedrock of everything that is done. And also it's a people issue. I meet a lot of folks who actually do not have the talent in this area. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so I'll pick up on two sort of maybe counterintuitive or not the usual aspects of this. Obviously, yes, incredibly important, sort of table stakes kind of issue. But there are two aspects to it. One is, I think, this talent issue, and whether it's cybersecurity or it's data and predictive analytics, or whether it's, flat out sort of tech skills. One of the very important issues, as we focus so much on issues of infrastructure, on issues of software and hardware, we tend not to think as much about those issues of talent and of the people that we need to solve these problems, and whether that's going to be creative public-private partnerships that allow for those conversations and the sharing of ideas and know-how, or whether it's hiring and creating the hiring authorities that allow us to bring in the people. It's very much about having the people who know how to do this work. And that's also, of course, about training and education, which is something in the background around all of this. The president can go to South by Southwest and ask technologists to come and work for the government, but to help the next administration and the administration after that and after that, we have to be worrying about how we're training people in the first place. Many people who are in government today are graduates of law schools, of public policy schools, of places where we're notoriously poor at training people around these sets of issues, and that's going to have to change. There's another aspect to this, though, which I'll just bring out, which is kind of at the intersection between these issues of cyber and privacy, which is that of what we sometimes like to think of as shades of open. So we're so worried about security and privacy that what we're often neglecting in these debates is also questions of responsible data sharing. So a lot of what we're seeing, particularly state and local also, and I'm sure you're seeing this too, is the desire to provide better services to people is going to be about having access to data and data across and between agencies about the social services that we deliver. So for healthcare.gov, you have to be able to means test people. You have to have access to that data so that you can deliver a service to them. If you want to think about now how you're going to bring down incarceration rates and bring down crime rates at the same time, we have to have better data about who's going through the criminal justice system. I saw that F report card that you gave almost across the board on that score. If we're talking about just delivering better benefits to people at lower cost and with greater efficiency, we can do a better job of one-stop, fill out one form and you get the benefits to which you're entitled, but all of that requires access to data, both two kinds of data, anonymized data at a population level so that we can spot trends and understand what's going on in our system, but then the ability to track individuals as they go through a system with a high degree of privacy and security that can actually allow us to deliver better services. So we have a range of issues that range from more open data to more privacy and protection against cybersecurity, and a lot in between, that kind of shades of gray where we need the right people to have access to the right data. Technology is going to allow that kind of responsible data sharing. Those right kinds of permissions can be created and set up, but we need the policy, we need the governance, we need the tools working together. So it's cyber, but it's a lot that goes in between to ensure that we're using data in the right ways.
Yeah. Well, I think when I talk to folks, excuse me, out there, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's unfortunate. So anything you want to care to add? I'm sure you had many discussions about this back in time, and I'm sure you do now as well. So what does that mean? And also, what role does the private sector play in this?
Well, I think this is something that we spent a lot of time thinking and worrying about in the White House. Whether it would be a cyber attack on the government itself or on infrastructure writ large or private industry like you saw with the Sony attack,
right.
Sony hack a few years ago. And, this is a place where the political system has failed. There was real momentum for cybersecurity legislation back, maybe 3 or 4 years ago that ran into, as even very basic legislation tends to run into, a set of political disputes. and then got wrapped up, unfortunately, with questions around NSA and privacy and complicated it. But I think there is a big step, and this is something that the president would constantly bring up in meetings just to make sure people were still thinking about it from a legislative perspective, from a policy perspective, from a communications perspective. How do we talk to the American people about this? Because it remains, we spend a lot of time worrying about ISIS attacking America in our public discourse, right? A much bigger threat to us is a complex cyber attack on our infrastructure, and this is going to require a governmental response, but it's going to require a partnership between the public and private sector to ensure that we're sharing best practices. We are working to get all the information in the hands of the right people to prevent and shut these things down before they become a huge problem.
All right, let's move to citizen engagement. Jesse, have you seen anything at this low-hanging fruit, I think? How is this changing in cities across the world?
I'll start with what I think is most encouraging and hopeful, and that is that it really makes participatory democracy possible. We can really hope for that. But in a little closer view, I see hundreds of great examples. It does come with a burden because none of the old channels go away. So we're in a multi-channel world now, and you've got to reach out to those citizens wherever they want to be. But you still have to hold those town hall meetings, and you still have to do your printed materials, but now you've got to do Twitter too, and Facebook, and now you've got to do Instagram, and. So that's the problem. Fortunately, there's more and more tools out there that let you do that kind of multi-channel communications and relatively easily. But yeah, I'm seeing it all over the place, and not just to your own citizens, but to tourists, let's say, or to business people that you're trying to recruit.
Are there any cities that are great examples?
I think Vancouver, BC is one great example. They wanted to have their, greenest city on earth by 2020.
Right.
This was several years ago, and they were able to engage, I think, 30 to 40,000 people in their process, much of it by social media, and stay in touch with them and do great progress reports, had clear metrics and indicators, reported every 6 months, posted new stuff, kept getting feedback to continually fine-tune their programs.
So Beth, I know you've worked on this issue a lot. Let's talk about citizen engagement, the promise of that.
Sure. So I'm going to disagree with my friend Eric Gordon. So I wrote that you quoted him as saying that citizen engagement is a necessary inefficiency. And Eric is a good friend of mine. He's editing a book that I have a chapter in coming up. But I think that's the old world. The notion that that all citizens can do is to talk, and therefore it becomes this burden to both have to broadcast out to people and then to listen to them talk with no return for government. It's that extra thing that we don't have time to do at 5 o'clock. I think is an old view that predates the technological era in which we live. And what do I mean by that? Take a look at what we've been able to accomplish in the last 6 years of the federal government, which is to set up a platform called challenge.gov. Challenge.gov, over 450 federal agencies have put up hard problems there and asked citizens to help with solving those problems. Not ask them, how do you feel about an issue? What do you think about it? Not inviting people to complain at you. That is the necessary inefficiency that we don't have time for. It says, help us to solve a hard problem about what do I do about the word gap that exists between the number of words that a rich kid and a poor kid hears before the time that they're 5. What do I do about removing the salt for salt water that helps farmers in the developing world become more productive with agriculture? It says people are smart, and we can use technology to tap into that intelligence. So British Columbia is a great example because they've set up something called the British Columbia Developers Exchange. They said, we know that in our backyard we have a lot of smart techies and developers, and so we're going to push government tech problems out to the citizens and ask people to help us, not by coming into government as kind of, BC Innovation Fellows, but instead by letting them sit where they're sitting, but pushing the problems out to them the way challenge.gov does, and engaging that talent from the outside. So I think the big transition that technology is allowing us to realize and to enable is engagement that's around tapping into what people know and can do, rather than just what they feel and what they think. And that's where it becomes not a necessary inefficiency, but I would call it a necessary efficiency that can actually help us to solve problems more quickly rather than less.
But I love that.
May
Go
I
ahead,
add to
Jesse.
that? Because Beth raises this great point. It's not just about the everyday citizen engagement. It's so important to get all your stakeholders engaged early in your smart cities planning. So last year, our 3 words were integrated, do things in a cross-cutting way, interoperable, make sure that your systems can talk to each other, and inclusive. So you need to plan with all so you can build for all. And the earlier you get these stakeholders involved in the planning process, and with these social tools, it's much easier to do that. You'll get better results, you'll get better ideas, and you'll get better buy-in. It's been a secret, and by the way, this is a secret that's working all around the world. You go to China, and they really understand the importance of getting citizens engaged right from the beginning. And Dubai, I mean, parts of the world you wouldn't expect them to be this attuned to it have discovered that it's really important.
So Dana, I have a question for you. Are any of you from Texas? Do we have any Texas folks here? A few. So I always find Texas so interesting politically because you have cities, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, some of those cities, and then you have a very conservative state overall. Well, it was interesting when I was there recently, they have the lowest voter turnout they're always like 49th or 50th, which I didn't know. So when you look at citizen engagement, and I'm sure you all talked about this a fair amount at the White House, this is a very concern for me. Citizen engagement is voting, let's say. How does that change? How do we really create a representative democracy, particularly with technology now and all of the promise of all that?
Well, I think one of the great disparities is between the technology available to us and how we vote. I mean, if you just watch some of the footage from some of these recent primary elections, put the caucuses aside, but actual state-run primaries like Arizona for a primary, people waited hours in line, both in the Republican and Democratic primary, to vote in the heat in Arizona, which sounds very unpleasant. And when you can do all these other things online, right? You can do financial transactions online. You can buy things. You can, do security background checks for the government. All these things, but you have to wait like we make voting in this country incredibly difficult, right? Whether it's individual state laws that are burdensome, lack of funding that would ensure that there are, like in Arizona, enough polling places to support all the people. Like you shouldn't have to wait in line to vote like it's Black Friday at Walmart, right? Like it's, it's sort of an insane process. But now you have this world where you could easily, of all these ways, DocuSign, other things to verify people's identity, you could easily get to a world where people could just sit at their computer over some period of time, one day or 2 weeks, and vote. And you could fundamentally make it easier on people to do it. And the more, I think it's a axiomatic statement that the more people vote, the better this country will be. More people will feel a stake in it. We will engage people as citizens, but we make citizenship so hard. We vote the same way now in a world where you have a powerful computer in your hand, where internet access could be available, on Wi-Fi, in lots of public places. We vote the same way we have for 50 to 100 years, right? Now, sometimes you have a little computer instead of, you fill it out like I don't know if they still take the SATs like this, but you fill it out, with the number 2 pencil.
Yes.
I live in San Francisco now, and I vote with a pencil, which is insane. We live you could throw a stone at Google and Facebook, and we vote like I registered for classes in college in the early 90s. There's so much opportunity to do it, but there's always been there is not an agreement that both parties see some advantage in whatever the law is, and it falls victim to polarization. But there's no reason why we couldn't use technology and the internet to make it very easy for people to vote.
So I'm going to Beth, but I want to let you know that I'm opening this up to questions from the audience. So there are microphones right here. So please think of some great questions for this fabulous panel here. Beth, do you have any comment on this discussion? I actually just find this area fascinating personally.
So the discussion of voting technology and the idea that we should be able to,
Or
that we should live in the 21st century.
Or even the late 20th.
Right, I mean.
I don't know, are you all for that? I'm for that.
And the fact that it falls prey to politics because any kind of modernization effort, right, is viewed as enfranchising somebody that you don't want to have vote for the other party, right? So it's, but there's definitely an effort. Look, a lot of these questions find their nexus at this set of issues also because we have issues of security, we have issues of privacy, we have issues of really how do you do this? And I think, let me generalize it for a moment because I think Dan really captured the essence of the issue, is that for all of these questions, we know what the cool tool is that's out there. We know the cool thing we want to accomplish. But there's a very big chasm between the idea and the implementation of that idea. And that's the big challenge, and that's not unique to government, but it has its own particular challenges because that chasm has pitfalls like procurement and civil service laws that make it hard to hire people, procurement laws that make it hard to acquire things, all kinds of rules that make it difficult to do things, and frankly, a lot of good pitfalls that are there for a good reason, namely we are stewards of the taxpayer dollar and the public trust, and we have to do things in a responsible way. And so it becomes very difficult to get from that great idea that so many people have. They don't have to be at the top. They can be in the middle somewhere or at the bottom, and the implementation of that idea, which also involves getting around a lot of what a friend of mine calls the no machines, aka the general counsel's office, the HR office, the procurement office.
No machines. I like that.
You know, fraught with dangers in between. And so that developing that capacity to know how to use technology and innovation to solve a problem, how to implement a project, how to develop the analytics and the metrics to allow you to do a better job of measuring in real time, is it actually working? So I think that's going to be the big next set of questions, is how we just get more agile at doing these things no matter what they are. And how we also do a better job of being more experimental in and experimental, I use that word deliberately, but being more experimental, we have to try stuff, see what works and evolve, but in a way that is actually careful with the public responsibility that's entrusted to those of us who serve in government. So I think it's a general statement around which I could make a lot of specifics. We've had a lot of wonderful success working with teams and individuals. I do a lot of work online with people. We run something we call the GovLab Academy. We've trained 450 people over the last year, primarily by bringing people together who are facing common kinds of challenges to cross that chasm from idea to implementation. And through mutual support and mutual learning, that exchange of best practices that groups like yours enable, so you can learn from China or Vancouver or this or that. That's the big thing, is how do we actually get these things done and do that in a faster way. Electronic voting is going to be one of those things, but it's a big place in which jurisdictions are looking to one another to figure out what to do and how to do it well and how to do it right, and that's going to require a lot of people coming together to have the right kind of dialogues.
All right, I'm opening up to you. Anybody have any questions?